We've previously examined Paul's theme of conflict in this letter. He writes about how, in the midst of interpersonal conflict, it is important to allow the gospel to define our relationships. We also looked at what he teaches about humility. Humility is putting others before ourselves, seeking their good instead of our own exaltation. It's important to remember that this prescription of humility is the means by which Paul intends the Philippians to respond rightly to their conflict. And the result of their humble response to conflict is unity being created between those who labor side by side for the gospel. So in this video, we'll examine the theme of unity and see how Paul fleshes out the basic principle of allowing the gospel to define our relationships. The letter to the Philippians can almost be thought of as Paul's guide to gospel partnership. Almost everything he writes in the letter is in conversation with the topic of Christian relationships. But the way Paul does this is by, once again, giving examples. He uses 6 people, or groups of people, to do this. Himself, some contentious ministers of the gospel, his fellow worker Timothy, Epaphroditus, the messenger from Philippi, those who are teaching a false gospel, and the Philippian church. Paul is going to take each of these examples and demonstrate to us how they all relate to each other when you arrange them around the gospel. As Paul goes through the book, he describes his relationship with each of these examples and tells the Philippians what he hopes their relationship with each of these will be like as well. We'll begin by seeing what we can learn from what Paul says about his own partnership, or lack of partnership, with each group. As we look at each one, we're going to focus on distilling each of his examples down to an applicable point for gospel partnership. The relationship that Paul spends the most time talking about in this letter is his relationship with the Philippian church itself. He talks quite a bit about how much he loves them and cherishes their partnership, how he prays for them, and how thankful he is for their faith, partnership, and generosity. He even makes the startling statement in verses 23 and 34 of chapter 1, together with verse 17 of chapter 2, that he would be happy to consider the purpose of his whole life and ministry to support their faith, joy, and ministry of the gospel. Paul also makes mention of these other ministers of the gospel, who have made themselves his rivals, preaching the gospel out of selfish ambition, as we've looked at previously. The way Paul elevates the importance of the gospel above the perceived success of any one person shows us, first of all, that both love and rivalry can actually be motivations for gospel ministry. The former, of course, being the only one that is good and pleasing to God, but that in fact it is the preaching of the gospel itself that is most important. After Paul describes his complicated relationship with these rival teachers, he gives 2 examples of good gospel partnership. The first is Timothy. Paul says that Timothy has worked alongside him like a son with his father. It's a striking image of just how closely God can unite 2 people who serve him together in humility. The next example of good gospel partnership is Epaphroditus. And again, Paul describes this relationship with metaphors demonstrating the bond of unity we have in the gospel. Brothers and sisters, co-laborers, soldiers fighting side by side. But after Paul gives these 2 examples of relationships that are drawn together by the gospel, he gives an example of a relationship that is instead divided by it. He talks about those who oppose the gospel, saying that he regards them with tears in his eyes, knowing that they have made themselves enemies of the cross of Christ. Allowing the gospel to define our relationships means making it the dividing line. When we look at the relationship between the Philippian church and the Apostle Paul from the perspective of the Philippians, Paul's exhortation is that they imitate him, and his commendation is that they have partnered with him so closely and generously that his difficulty has actually become their difficulty. When we begin looking at the way Paul relates each of these individuals or groups to the Philippian church, we'll notice how what Paul says about his relationship translates into an exhortation of how they should consider their relationship, echoing that key aspect of their relationship to Paul, to imitate him. When Paul directs their attention to Timothy, he tells them his relationship with him is like a father with a son, in order to support his request that they recognize how Timothy will be genuinely concerned for them rather than seeking his own interests. The example of Epaphroditus is very similar. Paul's interdependent relationship with Epaphroditus is applied to their partnership with him, as they understand that Epaphroditus will seek their well-being above his own, as he is demonstrated in Paul's account of verses 26 through 30 of chapter 2. When Paul tells the Philippians about those individuals who are opposing the gospel with their ministry, his command is to stay away from them. He does not want the Philippians to be influenced by these people, as an antithesis of his desire for them to imitate his life, which is a reflection of the life of Jesus Christ. Now, the first group of people Paul relates himself to were these contentious teachers, who were indeed preaching the true gospel, but doing it out of rivalry and selfish ambition. He doesn't say anything about how he hopes the Philippians will relate to these people. Instead, he uses them as a category, in which he will place the relationship of the two individuals in the Philippian church, Euodia and Syntyche. In the same way that Paul elevated the importance of the gospel over his personal disputes with the contentious teachers, he calls Euodia and Syntyche to examine these examples of good gospel partnership, define their relationship by the gospel, and agree together in the Lord. So as we attempt to make an application out of Paul's teaching in this letter, let's break it down into two separate points. First of all, when the gospel defines our relationships, it is necessary to choose those with whom we will partner based on their alignment with the gospel of Jesus. So partner with the Timothys, but not with the false teachers. Secondly, when we do engage in gospel partnership relationships, it is necessary to embody the crucial elements of partnership that Paul describes in this letter, remembering that the kind of relationship Paul had with the Philippians, with Timothy, and with Epaphroditus cannot come about without turning from the pursuit of our own interests to the pursuit of the interests of others. The final structural theme of the book of Philippians is the gospel. Paul lays out the gospel in chapter 2 as he tells the story of Jesus' humble obedience to the Father in coming down to earth as a man, dying on the cross, and ultimately being exalted as Lord of every person. He also uses verse 4 through 14 of chapter 3 to make astounding claims of what the gospel means to us personally. He says, first of all, in order to know Jesus and have the righteousness of God that is offered through him, we must let go of any attempts to gain righteousness in ourselves. Secondly, that losing everything that we've gained in order to have Christ instead is worth it because knowing Jesus is the nature of the value of the gospel. His point is that the gospel is not wonderful just because it is the means by which we escape judgment, or even because we gain streets of gold. The gospel is so wonderful and valuable because it's the offer of reconciliation. Paul loves the gospel so much because through it we gain God himself. Finally, Paul says that the effect that the gospel has on his life is continual. He lives it out every day, always straining forward for a greater and greater experience of knowing Jesus. As we've examined the other three themes, we've seen already most of what Paul teaches about the gospel. However, it is important to recognize its role in the chain of ideas. Paul presents his overall instruction to the Philippians. It is not his desire that the ultimate final result is the creation of unity between them and their partners. Rather, that unity having been achieved, the ultimate goal can now come about: the spread of the gospel of Christ. Paul makes this relationship between our unity and the advance of the gospel explicit in chapter 2, verse 15. He says that it is because of our living without grumbling and disputing with each other that the world around us sees the light of Christ. And now we've come full circle, back to the very first point Paul made regarding the conflict in which he finds himself: that his imprisonment has actually turned out to be good for the gospel, because when we respond to conflict with humility, our relationships in the gospel become unified, and Jesus is then seen in the way we live, because it is his life that we are living out. In the final video, we are going to see how Paul weaves the themes of joy, sacrifice, and thankfulness, and wrap up our study on the book of Philippians.